There's something nobody tells you when you're in the middle of it. When you're sitting in that quiet apartment, or lying awake at 2 in the morning, or scrolling through your phone just to feel like someone is nearby, nobody tells you that this feeling, this specific kind of ache, this hollow silence that seems to follow you everywhere, nobody tells you that this might actually be the most important season of your entire life. And I want you to really sit with that for a moment, because I know how hard it is to believe something like that when you're living inside it. We talk a lot about success. We talk about the breakthrough moment, the glow up, the comeback story. We love those. Social media is full of them. Before and after photos, the graduation post, the new job announcement, the relationship that finally worked out. We celebrate the after. We applaud the chapter that looks good, but we almost never talk about what happened in the pages just before that chapter began. We skip over the messy middle. We edit out the lonely parts. And because we never see them, we assume that loneliness before a breakthrough is abnormal. We assume it means something is wrong with us. We assume it means we're falling behind. But here's what psychology actually tells us, and I want you to hold on to this. Loneliness, real loneliness, the kind that strips away distraction and forces you into yourself, is often the psychological precondition for transformation. It is not the evidence that you are broken. It is the evidence that you are changing. Let me take you somewhere for a moment. Imagine a caterpillar inside a chrysalis. Now, most of us learned this story as children, and somewhere along the way, we romanticized it. We think the caterpillar goes in, takes a little nap, and comes out with wings. But that's not what actually happens. What actually happens is far more violent and far more beautiful than that. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body dissolves. Not transforms, dissolves. It becomes what scientists call imaginal soup. It loses its form entirely. There is a period inside that cocoon where, if you could look in, you would see nothing recognizable. Just cells, just potential, just something that used to be one thing and hasn't yet become another. And that is the phase, that is the loneliest phase, the in-between, the dissolved state, the place where your old identity doesn't fit anymore and your new identity hasn't formed yet. Psychologists call this a liminal period. The word comes from the Latin limen, which means threshold. You are on the threshold. You are in the doorway. You are not in the old room, and you haven't stepped fully into the new one yet. And thresholds are, by their very nature, uncomfortable places to stand. They are not designed to be lived in. They are designed to be walked through. But here is what nobody tells you about the threshold. It takes longer than you think it should. Sometimes months. Sometimes years. And the loneliness of that waiting, of that suspended state, is one of the most psychologically intense experiences a human being can go through. I want to talk about the specific quality of this loneliness, because not all loneliness is the same. There is social loneliness. That's when you're physically isolated, when you don't have people around you. And then there is existential loneliness. And this is something different entirely. This is the loneliness you can feel in a crowded room. This is the loneliness of feeling like no one around you really sees what you're going through. Like you're speaking a language that nobody else in your circle currently understands. Like you've outgrown something, a friendship, a mindset, a version of yourself. But you haven't yet found the people who belong to who you're becoming. And that gap, that space between who you were and who you are becoming, can feel impossibly wide. It can feel like standing on one side of a canyon, looking at the other side, knowing you need to get there, but unable to see the bridge. The psychologist Abraham Maslow talked about something he called metamotivation, the drive that pulls people toward self-actualization, toward becoming the fullest version of themselves. And he noticed something fascinating. The closer people got to that higher level of development, the more discomfort they often felt. Not less, more. Because growing into a more authentic version of yourself requires letting go of versions of yourself that no longer fit. And letting go, even of things that have been limiting you, even of things that have been hurting you, even of old identities that were never really yours to begin with. Letting go is a grief, and grief is lonely. Think about the people in your life who seem the most genuinely alive right now, the ones who have found their purpose, their peace, their direction. Think about what they looked like 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I would bet everything, that there was a period in their story that they don't post about, a chapter that didn't make it into the highlight reel, a stretch of time where they were quietly, deeply alone with something they were trying to figure out. Because this is not an accident of certain people's stories. This is a pattern. This is almost a psychological law. Carl Jung talked about the concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a fully integrated, fully realized individual, and Jung was very clear that this process is not comfortable. He described it as the confrontation with the shadow, with the parts of yourself you've suppressed, denied, or never allowed to exist. And that confrontation doesn't happen in public. It doesn't happen in a crowd. It happens in the quiet. It happens in the alone time. It happens in the exact moments that feel most unbearable. The things you are sitting with right now, in the silence that sometimes feels like it's going to swallow you whole, those are not signs that you are regressing. Those are signs that you are doing the deepest kind of inner work. That is individuation. That is you, finally, in the most private and sacred way, becoming. Now I want to address something, because I know some of you are carrying this thought. But I didn't choose this loneliness. It wasn't a spiritual decision. It wasn't a conscious growth journey. I just lost something. Someone left. Something ended. I got rejected, or I failed, or I was left behind, and I want to speak directly to that. Sometimes the loneliest phase isn't chosen. Sometimes it arrives like weather, and that can make it even harder to hold, because there's no framework for it yet. There's no narrative that makes it feel purposeful. It just feels like loss, just feels like pain, just feels like the ground giving way. But here is what the science of post-traumatic growth tells us, and this is real, this is studied, this is documented in hundreds of psychological research papers. The most profound personal development in human beings often follows experiences of loss, failure, and rupture, not despite those experiences, because of them. Researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun spent decades studying what happens to people after major adversity, and what they found was that a significant portion of people, not everyone, but a striking number, reported that after their darkest periods, they experienced meaningful growth. Not just recovery to where they were before, but actual expansion, greater empathy, deeper relationships, a clearer sense of what mattered, a more authentic engagement with life. They called it post-traumatic growth, and what's critical is what they identified as the mechanism. It was the rumination, not the distraction, not the numbing, not the burying of the pain, but the sitting with it, the allowing yourself to feel it, the lonely, quiet, sometimes excruciating process of actually engaging with what had happened to you. The loneliness, in other words, wasn't the problem to be solved. The loneliness was the pathway. Let's talk about identity, because I think this is at the heart of what makes this phase so disorienting. We are social creatures. Our sense of self is built in large part in relationship with others. We understand who we are, partly through how others reflect us back to ourselves. When we're surrounded by a consistent social world, same people, same roles, same expectations, our identity feels stable. We know who we are in that context. We know our role. We know our lines. But then something shifts. Maybe you change, or your world changes, or the people around you change. And suddenly that social mirror isn't reflecting back the person you feel yourself becoming. Maybe the people around you still see the old you. Maybe they're comfortable with the old you. Maybe they're invested in the old you. And you're sitting there, looking at them, looking at you, and feeling this quiet, aching sense of mismatch, of being misread, of being unseen. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson described periods of what he called identity moratorium, phases where an individual is actively exploring different possibilities for who they are, but hasn't yet made commitments to a new identity. These are periods of suspension, of being, in a sense, identityless, and they are profoundly uncomfortable because as human beings we have a deep psychological need for a coherent narrative self. We need to be able to answer the question, who am I, with some degree of confidence, And in the loneliest phase, the phase before your best chapter, you often cannot. You are between stories, and being between stories is one of the most vulnerable places to be. I want to give you something to hold on to here, a reframe that I hope changes the way you interpret your current season. In narrative psychology, the branch of psychology that looks at how human beings construct meaning through stories, there is a concept called the nadir experience. The nadir is the lowest point, the darkest moment. And what researchers have found is that in the life stories of people who describe themselves as having grown significantly, the nadir experience is almost always present. It is almost always a turning point. The low point and the turning point are often the same point. The psychologist Dan McAdams, who has spent decades collecting and analyzing people's life stories, found that individuals who score highest on measures of psychological maturity and generativity, the ability to contribute meaningfully to the world and to others, are those who are able to take their nadir experiences and integrate them into a coherent, meaningful narrative. They don't erase the darkness. They don't pretend it wasn't there. They weave it in. They find the thread that runs from that lowest point to where they are now, and they follow it. And here is what that means for you right now, in this phase. The loneliness you are living through is not a footnote. It is not an unfortunate detour. It is not the part of your story that doesn't matter. It is, in all likelihood, the hinge of your story, the moment everything turns on. You just can't see it yet because you're still inside it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being ahead of yourself. And I want to name this one specifically because I think it affects so many people who are in the middle of growth and can't quite understand why they feel so alone. When you begin to evolve, when you start making different choices, thinking different thoughts, asking different questions, wanting different things, you sometimes outpace the environment you're in. You can feel yourself pulling away from habits that used to comfort you. You can feel a quiet restlessness in conversations that used to satisfy you. You can feel the spaces where you used to fit becoming slightly too tight. And this is disorienting because nothing necessarily dramatic has happened. No one has done anything wrong. You haven't had a falling out. You haven't made a declaration. You're just different, quietly, privately, undeniably different. And the gap between who you're becoming and the world around you can feel enormous. Psychologists sometimes talk about this as vertical versus horizontal relationships. Horizontal relationships are those with people at a similar stage of development. They feel easy, comfortable, mutual. Vertical relationships are those across different stages of growth. They can be rich and valuable, but they can also feel lonely in a particular way, because there are things you simply cannot share across that gap. There are experiences that don't translate. There are conversations you want to have that the people around you aren't ready for yet. And so you hold those conversations inside yourself. You sit with those questions alone. And that holding, that sitting with the unexpressed, is part of the loneliness of this phase. But here's what I want you to hear. That unexpressed depth that you're carrying, that's not something wrong with you. That is the accumulation of interior growth. That is the reservoir that is filling up. And when you find your people, and you will find your people, when you step into the chapter that matches the person you've been quietly becoming, that reservoir will have things in it that will astonish you. You will have depth to offer that you couldn't have had without this time. You will have understanding, compassion, and wisdom that came specifically from the loneliness, from the holding, from the sitting with it. I want to address the shame now. Because there is shame wrapped around this loneliness for a lot of people, and I think it deserves to be spoken about directly. We live in a culture that treats loneliness as a personal failure. If you are alone, if you are struggling, if things are not going well for you, there is an ambient cultural message that tells you this is because you have somehow fallen short, that you are insufficiently likable, successful, entertaining, connected, that you should have figured something out that you have not yet figured out. And so people carry their loneliness quietly. They perform okayness while aching inside. They scroll through evidence of other people's full connected lives and compare it to their own internal experience, and they conclude that they are the problem, that they are uniquely, embarrassingly alone in a way that other people are not. But the research tells us something very different. Loneliness is one of the most universal human experiences. Study after study shows that a significant portion of people at any given time are experiencing meaningful loneliness, and that this number crosses all demographics, all ages, all apparent levels of social success. It doesn't matter how many followers you have. It doesn't matter how many people were at your party. The interior experience of feeling unseen, of feeling like a stranger to your own life, of feeling in between, that is a human experience, not a personal failure. And when it comes specifically to the loneliness of growth, of transition, of being in that liminal space, that loneliness is not just common. It is almost necessary. It is part of the process of becoming. The shame around it is the only truly unnecessary part. Let me bring you to something that the philosopher and psychologist William James wrote about more than a century ago, which feels more true today than perhaps it ever has. He wrote about what he called the sick soul, not as a diagnosis, but as a description of a certain kind of deep interior struggle that some people go through. The sick soul, James said, was someone who could not be satisfied by a superficial engagement with life, someone who had to go all the way down into the darkness of existence and find meaning there, or not at all, someone for whom easy answers were not enough. And here is the remarkable thing James said. He believed that the sick soul, the one who had gone into the depths and come back, had access to a richer, more integrated understanding of life than the person who had never gone there. The very sensitivity that made the darkness so dark was the same sensitivity that, on the other side of it, made the beauty so vivid. The very depth that made the loneliness so profound was the same depth that made the connection, when it finally came, so meaningful. You are not broken because you feel this deeply. You are not behind because you are struggling. You may simply be someone who cannot be satisfied by something less than the real thing, and that means you have to go further to find it. And that journey is longer and lonelier than the one other people around you seem to be taking. But where it leads is somewhere they haven't gotten to yet. I want to talk about solitude now because I think we need to separate it from loneliness, even though they often travel together. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted aloneness. Solitude is the practice of chosen aloneness, or more accurately, the practice of being with yourself in a way that is generative rather than depleting. And here is what is possible in this phase, even in the midst of the loneliness. You can begin to practice solitude within it. You can begin to relate to your aloneness differently. The philosopher Paul Tillich wrote that the courage to be requires the ability to affirm yourself in the face of the anxiety of loneliness. That true selfhood is not built in the crowd, but in the willingness to stand alone with your own existence and not run from it. In practical psychological terms, what this means is that the capacity to be with yourself, to sit in the quiet without immediately reaching for your phone, without immediately filling the space with noise or distraction, is one of the most important psychological muscles you can build, because it is in that space, that uncomfortable, sometimes aching space, that you begin to hear yourself, your real self, the self that has been forming under the noise. And the things you hear there, the desires, the questions, the values that begin to surface when the distraction is removed, those are the materials of your next chapter. That's the building happening. That's the foundation being laid, in the quiet, in the alone. In the place that feels like nothing is happening, when in fact everything is happening. There's a Japanese concept I want to bring in here, because it holds something that I don't think Western psychology has always been able to articulate as beautifully. The concept is ma. In Japanese aesthetics, ma refers to the meaningful pause, the pregnant silence, the space between notes and music, between words and poetry, between actions and life. Ma is not emptiness. Ma is the space that gives meaning to what surrounds it. This phase you are in, this pause, this silence, this space between chapters, is ma. It is not meaningless. It is not dead time. It is the space that will give your next chapter its resonance. It is the silence that makes the note, when it finally comes, ring true. And I want you to try, even just for a moment, to hold it that way, not as a void to be escaped, but as a meaningful pause, as something that matters. as the space that is quietly, invisibly doing something that cannot be done any other way. As we come toward the end of this time together, I want to speak to the person who is most afraid right now, the person who is wondering whether the next chapter will actually come, who is not just sad but scared, who is beginning to worry in the quiet of the early morning hours that maybe they've been waiting too long, that maybe the breakthrough isn't coming, that maybe this is just their life. I want to speak to that fear directly because it deserves to be spoken to, not dismissed. First, the fear itself is important information. The fact that you can feel the fear of staying stuck means that something in you is still reaching toward something different. Something in you has not given up on the idea that your life can be more than it currently is, and that reaching, that persistent, sometimes painful reaching, is not a sign of naivety. It is a sign of vitality. It is a sign that your deepest self has not stopped moving toward what it needs. Second, transformation does not operate on our timeline. This is one of the hardest things to accept about being human. We are biological, psychological beings living in clock time, and we want our growth to follow a schedule that makes sense to us. But growth follows its own logic, its own seasons, its own invisible calendar. And the phases that feel the most frozen are sometimes the ones where the most underground preparation is happening. There are trees that grow their root systems for years before they shoot up above ground. For a long time, if you were looking at them, you would see nothing. And then suddenly, everything. Third, you are not watching this from the outside. I know it can feel like you are a spectator to your own life right now, watching other people move and change and arrive while you stand still. But you are not still. You may not be able to see your own movement because you are inside it, but you are in motion. The fact that you are here, engaging with these ideas, sitting with these questions, trying to make sense of where you are, that is motion. That is the work. That is the chapter being written, even when it doesn't feel like writing. The loneliest phase comes before your best chapter, not as a rule of cosmic fairness, not as a reward system where suffering earns you something good, but because of what happens inside you when everything external is quiet and you have nowhere to go but inward, because of what gets built in the silence that cannot be built in the noise, because of who you become when the old version of yourself has dissolved and the new one is still forming, in the dark, in the patience, in the alone. The caterpillar does not experience the chrysalis as preparation. It experiences it as dissolution, as ending, as the loss of everything it knew itself to be. And then something happens that the caterpillar, in the language of caterpillars, could never have imagined. Something that couldn't have been imagined until it was lived. You are in the chrysalis right now. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not forgotten. You are becoming. And the chapter that is waiting for you on the other side of this, the one that will make sense of all of this, the one that will make other people ask how you got there, the one that you will look back on as the time everything changed. That chapter is not despite this loneliness. It is because of it. Hold on. Keep going. Do the quiet work. Trust the invisible process. Your best chapter is not a maybe. It is a when.